Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om. Namaste and good morning to all. I have been asked to speak on the subject, the Pre-Vedic and the Vedic times of Sanatana Dharma. It's a subject with certain amount of historical significance. And I shall try to present some of the important facts and ideas that our ancients have preserved for us as the documents of our great Sanatana Dharma through the Vedas and other auxiliary scriptures. Any discrepancies in this regard, in this talk, may be taken as my mistakes. While taking up a study on the ancient Sanatana Dharma, it is necessary to learn in some degree the customs of ancient Indian people, their objectives, the circumstances in which they lived, their habits, etc. Because it is these which have stirred the depths of their nature, molded their thoughts and determined the course of their life. It would be good to consider briefly the state of the society in which the doctrines of Sanatana Dharma or later Hinduism first began to visibly germinate and then gradually settled, and by which its systems were determined and illustrated. Sanatana Dharma at large rests upon the primary rock of Vedic Dharma. Vedic Dharma based on the Vedic life. The history of Aryan race from which such a system had sprung up is still a subject of controversy. Rig Veda, the very first text or the first recorded document of Aryans, does not provide any clues with regards to the Aryan migration from anywhere outside, as mentioned by many historians. When Aryans first appeared in the history, in those hymns of the old Rig Veda, we see them a sturdy race, active, intelligent, with simple habits and simple living. And to a large extent, they were found living in small villages and small towns, cultivating cereals and fruits in their fields and gardens, living very comfortably. That was their day-to-day life. As time passed, they populated, continued to increase in numbers, and occupied more and more territories, pushing southward and eastward from the northwest region, which were their original homes, original inhabitants. Their settlements were scattered. Land and the people were broken up into sections and to a great degree independent of each other. In some parts, they lived in the plains, spread out for miles, and in other regions, they lived in the valleys. Yet again, in some other regions, under tangled jungle cover of the country, filled with wild animals, etc. We find in the Rig Veda descriptions about the cultivation of their fields and gardens, nurturing from the waters collected in tanks and ponds covered with blue lotuses. That's how Rig Veda describes. Their wealth is said to have consisted primarily in cattle, goats, horses and sheep. They faced a lot of troubles, difficulties and rivalries, contested frequently, and their victories were well celebrated with the most spirited and joyous singing. So to say, by and large, they lived a natural active life, absorbed in their ordinary mundane activities. They defended their settlements and their supply of wants. And if at all they were divided, it was rather by the ordinary distinctions of the society only. The so-called caste system was unknown then. There was no caste systems. The word Aryan then and now means the same, a noble soul. An Aryan means a pious and noble person. Aryans possessed many striking features of character, and they were particularly distinguished by family ties and attachments. To them, home was a sacred place, and their community was always centered around them, with their affectionate and strong bonding. They lived their life following the seasonal changes. Vedas mentions about 6 seasons in a year that the Aryans had to face. But in particular, Vedas explains vividly the 3 distinct seasons. The cold, bracing winter with the brilliant blue sky, the hot season with its blinding glare and terrific dust storms, and the rainy season when the refreshing showers blessed the parched earth in carpets of rich green. This spectacular character of their daily life seemed reflected even in their spiritual lives. Religion, as we see today, was not that known then. The worship had only a few objects. They worshipped their deities to save them from the seasons. But the worship had only a few simple rites adhered to. Aryans regarded one great creator as the supreme and the all-sufficient divine behind this entire creation. In all their most ancient songs, we can find them speaking on the praise of this Almighty. But besides this supreme divine, they also had, to be precise, 33 other deities who had a direct relation to the immediate circumstances they lived in, like Agni, the god of light and fire, Indra, the god of the firmament or of the different heavenly worlds, Varuna, the god of orderliness, the god of sky, of moral laws, Ushas, that's a female dawn, the daughter of the sky, who age cannot touch, Maruts, the whirling winds, the attendants of Indra, and Ashwins, sons of the great sun god, and a few others. The Aryans revered them all. The light and fire in all their forms, their applications and uses, all of them were objects of special intense interest to the Aryans, that is the fire. They saw this mighty genial deity Agni, of the golden eye and golden hand, ever young. They saw him in their household fire. They saw him on the sacrificial altar. They saw him in the brilliant day and even in the terrific blazing of the kindled forests. Being a very powerful deity, the praises of Agni are frequent. The epithets applied and the petitions to him for the earthly objects of their desire are endless in the Vedic hymns. With longing eyes, they often praised the Lord of the Lords, Indra. Indra for his blessings, for rains and sunshine. Likewise, they praised every one of the 33 gods. Later, some of them were added too. They praised one by one for their mercy and favor. Now, these worships of Aryans were very simple in nature. They performed them on their family altars. Not once, not twice, but thrice daily, 3 times daily. The guardian of the house, mostly the father, the grandfather, or some elders of the family, laid a few sacred logs or twigs upon the blazing fire, poured out the offering of butter, and repeated their prayer or sacred song wholeheartedly to whomsoever they were intended. They spoke to their gods in most familiar terms, as if they were their own children. They sang their praises and offered them gifts. And at times they cried aloud for mercy and pleaded that their human infirmity was the cause of their errors. Such simple souls. On an occasion we find them imploring to Varuna, "O Lord Varuna, it was necessity on this drought days, a little bit of intoxication, some passion, dies even thoughtlessness. Why even sleep brings unrighteousness? Please pardon, O Lord." Such are the prayers we see in the Rig Veda. Offering of what used to be called the Somarasa or Soma juice to Lord Indra was very frequent practice. They also partook a portion of the Somarasa as a remnant of the offering, but not to the extent to get drunk. Of course, they regarded a mild intoxication as some sort of a spiritual feeling, bringing them in closer communion with their deity. Also, there used to be the special Soma Yajna, which used to be mostly celebrated in public, participated by the entire village or entire community in general, expressing themselves thus naturally, holding a close connection with their various gods, and offering new prayers and praises as the circumstances dictated, collected from those scattered settlements. They gathered and brought together those most ancient hymns of the famous Rig Veda. Writing was entirely unknown in that age. There was no script of any kind. Therefore, their praises and prayers to their gods, they were all transmitted one to the other entirely by memory from generation to generation. But special care were taken to ensure that they transmit them with great correctness. There was no priesthood then, no priesthood as in the later days. This is how the Aryans lived on for hundreds of years. And as they grew in numbers, they slowly spread to every corner of the nation. It was at this point that a rudimentary form of Sanskrit, not exactly Sanskrit, known as Prakrita, came up as a dialect, as a spoken language. Later, with their much developed Sanskrit speech, they could extend their authority and enlarge their territory. The earliest language of Aryans was Prakrita. It was a language, as I said earlier, spoken by the masses without a script. But it was closely connected to the non-classical form of Sanskrit. Vedic Sanskrit also is partially different from the later sophisticated form of classical Sanskrit. It was developed firstly through the natural process of evolution and secondly through the steady social changes. There are two formats of Sanskrit language thus. One the pre-classical Vedic Sanskrit and the other the highly refined classical Sanskrit. In the widest sense, Sanskrit as a language developed through three successive stages. In the first stage, it was predominantly used as a dialect about which we have hardly any idea today. It was some kind of a mixture of Prakrita. In the second stage, during the proper Vedic times, as a developing language, Sanskrit was used basically for the sole purpose of performing yajnas. Yajnas are rituals performed through the means of fire. It was discovered that, being a powerful language, Sanskrit has greater potentiality to convey both mental and spiritual aspirations of human by seeking and visualizing the unseen in so many ways through the media of yajnas. The Vedic portions known as the Brahmanas. Brahmanas were largely developed at this stage. A little later, Sanskrit also developed its script. From then began the development of its third classical era. But such fairly rapid linguistic changes, in fact, would have started much before the Vedic period itself. Though Sanskrit was recognized as a literary language, having great linguistic elements, at that point of time, it was still not used for recording any literary documents. As far as classical Sanskrit is concerned, its rapid evolution has stopped at this particular point of time. And an educational system associated with it came to be known as Shruti, or memorization, which was given greater importance. The Aryans found that memorization was a better method to preserve Vedic documents for posterity. They believed that hearing and preserving through memory, known as Shruti, was found to be a better method or better format, which cannot be destroyed unless the entire humans became extinct. As far as Sanskrit phonetics are concerned, the first two, that is the Pre-Vedic and the Vedic Sanskrit, had considerable differences between them. But such phonetic changes among the second and third, that is the Vedic Sanskrit and the classical Sanskrit, is found to be very negligible. The later development and standardization of Sanskrit as a classical language was something very rapid. Now back to the Vedic period. We can observe two major developments during the Vedic civilization. One, a spiritual culture. Second, an adherence to moral law. These two distinct developments were greatly due to the highly conservative tendencies with which they grew up, which rather characterized the Vedic life itself. This conservative aspect of the race instilled in the Aryans a great self-respect. They believed that this conservative aspect is a must, and they developed it in their personal life. As their civilization rose to a higher level due to the development of the Sanskrit language, their habits and communications developed rapidly, and side by side their settlements were enlarged, developed, synchronized, and established some powerful kingdoms. And later, when their systems of philosophies developed, the people at large and the learned classes in particular reached perhaps the highest point of civilization and mental vigor when Alexander entered the Punjab region. The Aryans were holding the whole of Upper India. They reached up to Vindhyan range, Vindhya mountains, and their territory then came to be known as the Aryavarta, the land of the Aryans or the land of Aryas. Through the influence of their spiritual, cultural and moral law, great changes had come all over the Aryavarta. The greatness of Aryans was explicit in the sense, by no means they exterminated the original inhabitants of the land that they had captured through wars and other means. In fact, many traces of such original inhabitants exist throughout the country, down even to the present day. In fact, those inhabitants or tribes mingled with their conquerors, and they existed separately with their demarked borders. All over Aryavarta, living independent and free, occupied and cultivated, the old countryside, as explained in the Vedas, appeared probably the same as it does now. On the other hand, they cared for nature. Caring for nature, dense forest areas were developed along the mountain valleys. For instance, the mountain valleys of Himavat or Himalaya stood as a mighty range clad with dense forests of pine trees. The Aryavarta had its own beauty. The villages were few and far between, built of mud huts or cottages of bamboo and mat. And they were surrounded by mud walls for self-defense and governed by better fraternity, maintained with a kind of municipal element that exists down to the present day. A town was the most civilized portion of the Aryan community. And there lived some large and wealthy who had brick and stone houses, and still better buildings were there as the palaces of kings and his chieftains. The introduction of horse to the community itself was an event. Its usefulness for transportation and in wars made it a popular animal. Horse care and horse training, they were available, and they were carried out by specialists. All this can be found in the Vedic culture. But strangely enough, though the people were spiritual, there is no mention of any temples as such, both in the pre-Vedic and the Vedic era. Worships were performed largely through yajnas, to the fire god, otherwise in the shrines at home. Another striking aspect is that the women in that period of history enjoyed far greater freedom than those in the later times. Women could walk and ride anywhere. They could be openly present at all public festivals and shows. Thus, we can gather from the Vedas a lot about the earlier settlements of the Aryan race. They lived scattered and much separated from one another. But wherever they went, however far they were spread over, they carried with them their spiritual culture. Certain worshipping rites transmitted to them from the ancient times and hymns taught by their fathers, the ceremonies and customs in which they had been trained, they were regarded with the highest veneration. All of these were preserved by memory alone. While their faith and their lives were built upon the natural environment, they continued with their composition of new hymns, which were adapted in the various circles and specific families, which kept spreading all over the Aryavarta. These ancient songs were preserved with utmost care, which later came to be known as the Samhita portions of the Rig Veda. And within 300 or 400 years, Aryans also came up with the ritual portion of the other Vedas. Explanation of these worship rituals and the speculations of their Brahmanas also were produced probably almost at the same time. All of these were transmitted from generation to generation. As they depended only upon their memories, they made extraordinary efforts to master them to the minutest detail. It is stated that this art of memorization was a great effort. Individuals spending their time and energy for 12 to 48 years to master these works by heart. The care employed for this purpose of preserving a legacy cannot be unseen and not appreciated. This necessitated of having a class of people among them wholly devoted solely to such efforts, who worked hard ages after ages to commit them to memory, generation after generation. Aryans did not adopt or teach things because they were conventional rules. Aryans merited life as precious in its own way. They often fancied that there was something divine in these arts of memorization and communication. Therefore, they regarded their literary compositions with great respect and amazing reverence. Such respect and reverence were not mere sentiments. Each syllable and each letter they mastered were regarded with profound awe. And so, they took all effort to maintain the tone and emphasis with which each of them be pronounced. They well understood that any mispronunciation of even a single accent would mar the power of the prayer. In the later stages, people have understood that the prayers like Gayatri, Savitri, and also other mantras have their own great merits with their proper intonations. But in spite of all such caretaking, the circumstances in which the communities were placed, various differences naturally developed in course of time in the text of their hymns and prayers, and also in the proceedings of their ceremonies. Thus, different localities acquired different editions or different shakas, they are called, the branches. At first, in the recensions of Rig Veda, the families and individuals that followed a particular shaka or branch were then called a particular charana. And among the various charanas, in most places, there existed different parishads or coteries or groups of well-qualified individuals who functioned as referees or authorities on all disputed questions of syllables or words or even sentences of the sacred Vedic text. As the population spread and compositions increased, there were varied charanas with varied readings, not only in the Rig Veda Samhita, but to every Samhita and also every Brahmana of all the four Vedas. In spite of all precautions, through death of individuals and decay of legacy and extinction of different families, in many cases, the hymns, the rites, customs and treatises that were once well known became obsolete, and some of them were eventually lost. Therefore, the Vedas and the other ancient works that we have today are only certain portions, though a considerable one, of the literary compositions which their intellect and imagination put forth through the ages without the aid of any written documents. Such were the people of this land, wherefrom a magnitude of philosophical works sprang. Such has been the history of their thinking, from which their knowledge and their science percolated. Their scholars had no institutional help of the modern times, but they did have the aid of those accumulated wisdom. Rather, they had those experience or conclusions of an earlier civilization, which seemed to have breathed altogether a different air of experience. They knew only one country, the Aryavarta. They knew its broad borders and their native tribes. They had the materials of their thinking and rules of their inquiry, and they had preserved both of this for the posterity. Their systems were native but original. Their philosophy being the first of its kind, maybe without constraints, free and even unsatisfactory. But they were the creation of their own thinking. Their research may be partial, and their reasoning inconclusive from the point of the present wise or wiser age. But it has been established convincingly today that they were way ahead of any civilization anywhere else in the world. In course of time, the Aryans speculated their philosophies and gathered theories respecting the various modes of liberating the soul, liberating the human spirit. And with a view to aid their learning and by hearting all necessary formulae of the Brahmanas, of the Vedas in particular, they scripted then another easy system called the Kalpa Sutras, which itself requires a great study. I'm not going into any details of it, when the philosophies of Aryans too received a similar treatment, the principles of inquiry became more defined. Reasons, arguments, and illustrations were brought forward in defense of their opponents. Controversies became sharp. Speculations and philosophies were shifted, arranged, and settled. And apparently, in a few hundred years, a great system called Sanatana Dharma came to be more popular. I cannot say it was formatted. It has been always existing from time immemorial. Dharma is something that makes a society to stand. So it has been a system ever existing. The order in which they all started is not distinctly known, and probably to ascertain them today is not a matter of vital consequence. Thank you. Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om.